Jaden was just a quiet scholarship student, invisible to the elite of Willow Ridge Academy. But one unexpected moment changed everything. You won't believe what happened when he sat at the piano. Watch to the end to see how he turned the tables. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps bring more powerful stories to life. The grand iron gates of Willow Ridge Academy stood tall under the morning sun, their golden crests glinting against the perfectly paved roads leading inside. The prestigious private school, one of the most elite academies in the state, was where the children of the wealthy and powerful learned socialized and secured their futures. Expensive cars lined the front entrance, dropping off students dressed in designer clothes, their confidence effortless, their presence commanding. Laughter filled the air, echoing between the neatly trimmed hedges and marble statues adorning the academy's vast courtyard. This was a place where status wasn't just expected, it was required. Stepping off an old, rusting school bus, Jaden Carter adjusted the straps of his worn-out backpack, lowering his gaze as he took his first steps onto the pristine pavement. His sneakers, slightly frayed at the edges, contrasted sharply against the polished shoes and high-end loafers surrounding him. No one turned to look at him. No one welcomed him. To them, he was just a shadow in their world, a nobody who had entered their sanctuary through a scholarship, not through birthright. At Willow Ridge, money wasn't just power, it was identity. And Jaden, he had none. Keeping his head down, he moved swiftly past groups of students huddled in conversation, laughing over weekend yacht trips and extravagant parties. He didn't belong here, and everyone made sure he knew it. Carter Harrington, the school's golden boy, watched him from a distance, his sharp blue eyes gleaming with something between amusement and disdain. Carter was everything Jaden wasn't: rich, influential, effortlessly charming. The son of a powerful senator and an esteemed entrepreneur, Carter had never known struggle. And more than anything, he despised seeing people like Jaden in his world, as if their very presence tainted the academy's perfection. "Look, it's the scholarship kid," Carter's voice rang out, just loud enough for Jaden to hear. A few heads turned, snickers following his words. "I wonder if he's had breakfast today," another voice chimed in mockingly. "Doubt it. Maybe he'll beg for food at a church again." Jaden's fists clenched inside his pockets, but he kept walking. He was used to this. Every day was the same. Taunts, whispers, dismissive glances. At Willow Ridge, students like him were invisible unless they were being humiliated. The school building loomed ahead, an architectural masterpiece, its massive pillars and glass-paneled halls a testament to the wealth that funded it. Inside, chandeliers lined the ceilings, casting golden reflections onto marble floors. Even the classrooms had an air of exclusivity: modern desks, expensive projectors, a scent of fresh polish lingering in the air. Jaden slid into his usual seat at the back, hoping, as he always did, to simply go unnoticed. But in a school where everything was a hierarchy, there was no escaping where he stood. The day passed as it always did. Lectures, assignments, group projects where no one wanted to pair with him unless forced. Lunch was spent at the farthest table in the cafeteria, away from the social elite who dictated the unspoken rules of Willow Ridge. He didn't mind. He had learned long ago that solitude was easier than forced tolerance. After school, while others were picked up by drivers in luxury cars, Jaden took the bus home, the seats torn, the air conditioning barely functioning. He didn't return to a mansion or a house with a backyard. He returned to a small apartment, the scent of detergent and old furniture welcoming him. His mother, Monica Carter, worked long shifts at the hospital, often coming home exhausted, but always greeting him with a tired smile. She was the only person who believed in him, who reminded him that his worth wasn't defined by the people at Willow Ridge. "How was school today, sweetheart?" she asked, setting down her bag, rubbing her temples as she collapsed onto the worn-out couch. "Same as always," Jaden muttered, not wanting to burden her with the details. She had sacrificed too much already, her time, her energy, everything, to give him a chance at something better. Despite the weight of the world pressing down on him, there was one thing that made Jaden different from the students who looked down on him. One thing that Carter and people like him could never take away: music. Ever since he was a child, Jaden had been captivated by the piano. While other kids played video games or watched TV, he sat at the old piano in a nearby church, his small fingers tracing the keys, learning through nothing but trial and error. He had no teachers, no expensive lessons, no grand pianos at home. Instead, he had an old second-hand phone filled with recordings of Debussy, Beethoven, and Chopin. He had borrowed books from libraries, copied sheet music by hand, practiced in silence when no one was around. He didn't just play the piano, he lived in music. But at Willow Ridge, his passion had no place. The music program was reserved for the elite, the students whose parents paid for the best tutors, the ones who practiced on Steinways and performed at prestigious recitals. Jaden, with his self-taught skills and no formal training, didn't belong in that world. Yet, no matter how much they tried to push him into the shadows, music was the one thing they couldn't strip from him. It was his, and his alone. He glanced at his mother, sleeping soundly on the couch, exhaustion evident in the way her shoulders sagged. She had given everything so he could have a future, so he could have a chance. He had to make it count. What he didn't know was that his chance was coming sooner than he expected, and it would change everything. The next morning, Jaden arrived at Willow Ridge Academy with the same routine: head down, steps quick, blending into the background. He had long mastered the art of being invisible, of making himself small enough to avoid unnecessary attention. But no matter how much he tried to disappear, some people made it their mission to remind him of his place. As he walked through the hallways, laughter followed him. Carter Harrington and his group of friends lounged near their lockers, perfectly groomed, their confidence effortless. Jaden kept his gaze straight ahead, pretending not to hear them. "Careful where you step, Carter," one of the boys smirked. "Wouldn't want to get charity on your shoes." Carter chuckled, his voice carrying that casual cruelty only the privileged could afford. "Yeah, wouldn't want to catch whatever disease poverty spreads." Jaden's grip on his backpack tightened, but he kept walking. This wasn't new. It never would be. He entered his music class, sinking into the back row. The room was elegant, adorned with framed photographs of past student performances, grand pianos gleaming under the soft overhead lights. Music at Willow Ridge was more than just an elective. It was a status symbol. Those who played were the Academy's pride, performing at elite events, praised by teachers and parents alike. Mr. Grayson, the Academy's senior music teacher, entered with his usual air of authority. He was a thin, middle-aged man with sharp features, a tailored suit, and an expression that rarely changed. He had spent decades molding students into performers, but only the ones he deemed worthy, the ones whose parents could afford to ensure their success. Jaden had never been one of them. Grayson clapped his hands together, signaling for silence. "Today's lesson will be different," he announced. "I want to see something beyond technical skill. Music is about emotion, interpretation. We'll do an exercise." His gaze swept across the room, already knowing who would shine and who would fade. "Each of you will come up and play something, not a rehearsed piece, something spontaneous. I want to see your connection to music." Excited murmurs broke out among the students. Most of them had been playing for years, their confidence unshaken. Jaden kept his head down, hoping Grayson would skip over him. But he should have known better. Carter was the first to step up, walking to the grand piano like he owned it. He played effortlessly, a quick classical piece, his fingers gliding over the keys with precision. He finished with a smug smile, bowing slightly as the class applauded. Grayson nodded approvingly. "Well executed, Harrington, as expected." One by one, the other students took their turns. Some were impressive, others less so, but each performance was met with polite acknowledgement. Then, just as Jaden thought he had been spared, he heard his name. Jaden Carter. The words rang in the silent room, and for a moment, Jaden thought he had misheard. But the way Carter smirked, the way whispers spread through the class, confirmed the worst. Grayson stood at the front, his expression unreadable. "Would you like to give it a try, Carter?" the teacher asked, his voice carrying something almost condescending. "Or are you more comfortable listening through your headphones?" A few quiet chuckles. Carter's grin widened. Jaden felt every muscle in his body tense. He could refuse. He could shake his head and stay seated, letting this moment pass. But if he did that, if he stayed silent, it would become the truth they wanted. That he wasn't worth noticing. That he didn't belong here. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "You don't need to prove anything to them, but never let anyone look down on you." Jaden took a breath, forcing his feet to move. The classroom seemed to shrink as he walked to the front, each step heavier than the last. The whispers grew louder. When he reached the piano, he hesitated. The keys stretched before him, familiar yet foreign under so many watchful eyes. He had never played in front of an audience. He had never even considered it. Behind him, someone scoffed. This should be good. He could turn back now, say he didn't know how to play, let them laugh and move on. Or he could play. Jaden sat down, his fingers hovering over the keys. He exhaled slowly, pushing away the weight of expectation. Then, without another thought, he let his hands move. The first note rang out, a soft, lingering sound that seemed to stretch into the silence. Then another. The room, once filled with snickers and whispers, stilled. The melody grew, unfolding like a story told in a language only music could convey. He played not for them, but for himself. For the long nights in the church, practicing in the dim light. For the hours spent listening to recordings, memorizing every note by heart. For his mother, who had sacrificed everything so he could have this chance. The melody of Claire de Lune floated through the room, filling every corner. It was soft, yet powerful, delicate, yet unshakable. Each note carried the weight of his struggles, the loneliness, the quiet determination. The laughter had stopped. Carter was no longer smirking. Mr. Grayson, who had expected a failure, watched with furrowed brows, his arms slowly uncrossing. Jaden's fingers moved effortlessly, as if the piano had always been waiting for him. The notes swelled, then faded into a whispering conclusion, the final chord lingering in the air. Then, silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Jaden sat frozen, his hands still resting on the keys, his breath unsteady. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. For the first time, they saw him. And no one dared to laugh. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as if the very air in the room had shifted. Jaden remained seated at the piano, his fingers still hovering over the keys, his breath shallow and uneven. He hadn't expected applause. He hadn't expected anything at all, but the sheer absence of sound, of laughter, of whispers, it was almost surreal. The same students who had mocked him minutes ago now sat motionless, their expressions frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Carter Harrington's smirk was gone. He had been leaning back in his seat, confident, relaxed, waiting for a performance that would reinforce what he already believed, that Jaden Carter was beneath him, that he didn't belong here. But now he sat forward, arms crossed tightly, his jaw clenched, his gaze dark and unreadable. His friends, the ones who had chuckled so openly when Jaden's name was called, now exchanged uneasy glances. Jaden finally lifted his hands from the keys, exhaling slowly. He didn't dare turn to face them. He didn't know what would come next. All he knew was that, for the first time since stepping into this school, he had done something that none of them could ignore. Mr. Grayson, who had been standing near the whiteboard with his arms crossed, shifted his stance. His brow was furrowed, his lips slightly parted, as if he was trying to reconcile what had just happened with what he had expected. He had called Jaden up there to teach him a lesson, to expose his lack of skill, to reinforce the invisible hierarchy that ruled Willow Ridge. But instead, he had been caught off guard. Jaden dared to glance at him. The older man's jaw tensed, his fingers flexing at his sides. It was only a fraction of a second, but in that moment, Jaden saw something he had never expected to see in Mr. Grayson's face. Doubt. A single clap rang out from the back of the room, then another. Slowly, like a ripple in water, the sound grew. Some students hesitated, uncertain, their pride warring with the undeniable truth of what they had just heard. But as the applause spread, it became something undeniable. It wasn't polite, it wasn't forced, it was genuine. Jaden swallowed hard, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs. His breath was still uneven, his mind still catching up to the fact that this was happening. He had played for himself, expecting nothing, but now, for the first time, the people around him were acknowledging him. Not as the scholarship kid, not as an outsider, but as a musician. Carter's expression darkened. He wasn't clapping. His fingers curled into fists where they rested on his desk, his posture stiff. The humiliation was evident in his eyes, not just because Jaden had played well, but because he had done something Carter couldn't argue with. Talent wasn't something that could be bought, and for once, Carter's money, his influence, his name, it meant nothing in the face of what had just happened. Mr. Grayson finally spoke, his voice slower than usual, carefully measured. That was unexpected. He paused, the weight of his own words hanging in the air. "You played well, Carter. Very well." Jaden blinked, his body still tense, waiting for the inevitable follow-up. The dismissal. The way Grayson would find a way to undercut the moment, to maintain the balance of power in this room. But for once, the teacher said nothing more. He simply turned away, walking toward his desk. Jaden rose from the piano bench, his legs feeling heavier than they had before. He returned to his seat, aware of every pair of eyes following him. He had walked to the front of the room expecting to be humiliated. Instead, he had done something none of them could ignore. As he sat down, Carter finally moved. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but edged with sharpness. "Don't think this changes anything." Jaden didn't respond. He didn't need to, because deep down, he knew that everything had already changed. The rest of the class passed in a strange haze. Jaden barely heard Mr. Grayson's final words, barely noticed the students packing their things, barely felt the weight of his own backpack as he slung it over his shoulder. His mind was still replaying the last few minutes, the sound of the piano, the stunned silence, the hesitant but undeniable applause. He had never imagined a moment like this, never thought he would be seen, let alone acknowledged. Yet it had happened. He had forced them to listen. As he stepped toward the door, he felt the heat of a glare burning into him. Carter Harrington hadn't moved from his desk. His arms were crossed, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked onto Jaden with something between anger and disbelief. Jaden didn't look away. He wasn't scared of Carter anymore. Not after this. The door swung open before he could reach it, and a tall figure stepped inside. The room stilled. Mrs. Collins. She wasn't just any teacher. She was one of the longest-standing members of the Willow Ridge faculty, a woman whose reputation carried weight. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly pulled back, her sharp eyes scanning the classroom with the quiet authority that demanded respect. She had been a part of the academy longer than most, and unlike many of the teachers, she wasn't swayed by money or influence. She valued talent, not privilege, and now she was looking directly at Jaden. "I heard the music from the hallway," she said, her voice calm but firm. She glanced toward Mr. Grayson, whose lips tightened. He nodded but didn't speak. Mrs. Collins turned her gaze back to Jaden, studying him. Then, in a voice that sent a ripple through the class, she asked, "Have you ever considered applying for a music scholarship?" The room froze. Jaden's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't have heard that right. A music scholarship? Here? At Willow Ridge? For a second, he thought she was joking. A cruel trick. Another way for the school to remind him that he didn't belong. But Mrs. Collins wasn't the type to waste words. The reaction around the room was immediate. Some students exchanged stunned glances. Others looked outright offended, as if the idea of Jaden receiving such an opportunity was an insult to the school itself. But the most intense reaction came from Carter. His fingers clenched into the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. His entire body tensed, the fury barely contained. This wasn't just about Jaden playing well anymore. This was something bigger, something that could change everything. Jaden felt his pulse pounding in his ears. His thoughts were a blur. A scholarship? A real chance? For so long, he had accepted that Willow Ridge was temporary, a stepping stone, a struggle he had to endure for a better future. He had never let himself dream that this place could become more than that he could carve a place for himself here, that he could actually belong. But now, that possibility was staring him in the face. He swallowed, forcing himself to speak. The words felt heavy, almost too big for him to say. He looked at Mrs. Collins, at her expectant but unwavering expression, and he realized something. She wasn't offering this out of pity. She wasn't offering this because of charity. She was offering it because she saw something in him, because he had earned it. He straightened his shoulders. "I want to try." Mrs. Collins nodded, satisfied. "Good. Come by my office after school. We'll discuss the application process." She turned to leave, and the moment she stepped out, the tension in the room erupted. Carter shoved his chair back with a loud screech, standing so abruptly that a few students flinched. His glare could have cut through steel. "This is a joke." His voice was sharp, furious. "You think he deserves a scholarship?" He gestured toward Jaden, disgust evident in every syllable. "This school has standards." Jaden didn't flinch. Not this time. Mr. Grayson cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. "That's enough, Harrington." Carter turned on him. "You agree with this?" Mr. Grayson hesitated for only a fraction of a second. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. A hesitation that Carter caught, that everyone caught. The teacher sighed. "This is not up for discussion." For the first time, Carter looked genuinely shaken. He wasn't used to losing. He wasn't used to being told no. His entire life had been built on the assurance that people like Jaden didn't win. But today, Jaden had. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. Students hesitated, unsure of what to do with the tension still lingering in the air. Jaden didn't wait. He grabbed his bag and walked out, his heart still hammering, but his steps steady. He didn't stop until he was outside. The crisp afternoon air hit him, cooling the heat that had built inside. He inhaled deeply, trying to process everything. He had played. He had been heard. And now he had a chance at something real. The walk home felt different. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged, but something in him had shifted. When he reached the small apartment, he hesitated only for a second before pushing the door open. His mother was there, still in her nurse's uniform, rubbing tired eyes. She looked up as he stepped inside, and immediately her exhaustion was replaced with concern. "Jaden, what's wrong?" He had prepared himself for this moment, had rehearsed how he would tell her. But now, standing in front of her, it all came tumbling out. "I played today," he said, his voice unsteady, "in front of the whole class." His mother's expression softened. "And?" He swallowed hard. "They listened." His throat tightened. "And they offered me a scholarship." For a long second, she didn't say anything. Then she let out a breath, slow and shaky, as if she had been holding it for years. "A scholarship," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Mrs. Collins. She said I should apply." Something broke in her then, not sadness, not worry, but relief. She stepped forward, pulling him into a tight embrace. He felt the warmth of her arms around him, the quiet strength that had carried them both through every struggle. "You did it," she whispered. Jaden closed his eyes. He wasn't there yet. The road ahead was still uncertain. He didn't know if he would win the scholarship. He didn't know if this was just the beginning of another uphill battle. But, for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. For the first time, he believed. Jaden's life would never be the same again. But was this just the beginning of a bigger challenge? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps bring more inspiring stories to life. See you in the next video.